Hey everyone, welcome to the second devlog. This is the second part in a series going over the process of making our first horror game, which is called Bounding Main. If you'd like some more information about what this game is and what it's about, then you can go ahead and watch the first part of this devlog series. Yeah, just to talk about sort of what I did since the last devlog. There's a few things I did that I didn't record just because it's pretty boring, let's be honest. Like I was talking about in the last video, I went back and I fixed the models with the corridors and I got the materials working. And yeah, it was looking pretty solid. I also made a change to the models because the wires were off to the side, which I like the look of that better, but the problem that I kept running into was that if I wanted to rotate the models around, like for example, with a corner or a T intersection, then the wires would not line up anymore. So I would have to have two mirrored versions for every single model. And no, that's too much work for me. So I changed it to just being in the center and that fixed all those problems. But yeah, doing all these corridors and rooms, it takes a long time to do all these different variations. It's a lot of work. And of course, it's great having that first corridor as a base for all the others, but it's still a ton of modeling that I have to do. There's always this little voice inside my head that just keeps telling me to use the free assets on the Unity marketplace. But I don't know. I think it's sort of good experience for me to do these models myself. And you know, I think it creates sort of our own unique visual identity. If we were using free assets on the store, I think it would be harder to sort of match their theming together, if that makes sense. Yeah, other than that, I got a working door. So you can see this. Basically, it's if the player is within the distance of the door, then they can press E. And something I do need to add to that is basically like a little prompt that tells you to press E to interact with the door. I also modeled this computer terminal. So this, in the game, will have a few different functions. So I'm thinking its primary function is to read crew logs and notes. And this would basically be more for like more of an optional story type addition to the game. It definitely wouldn't be required. But I was also thinking there could be a few more important functions that the terminals do, perhaps unlocking a door or something like that, or deactivating an alarm. I think there's a lot of options that a terminal like that sort of provides. So that's sort of why I went with that. At this point, I also, we spent some time coming up with a rough layout for the facility. And you can see that image here. This is just sort of the rough diagram we have. We probably will go through this and make a few changes here and there, but I think it's pretty solid for now, at least just to start. I might add another section sort of near the top left. I think it's pretty good. So after having that planned out, I spent a ton of time going through and actually building it. And this took a long time. It's sort of my own fault. I didn't realize you can just press Control D to duplicate a prefab. And that would have made this a little bit faster, but it is what it is. One thing I'd also like to sort of bring up, I have been putting all of these models into prefabs, and I can't tell you that that's the right way to do it because I don't know, but I'm assuming. Because basically what that allows us to do is, like, if we want to make a change to one model, then we can apply that change to every model in the scene at the same time. Otherwise, if we didn't do that, we would have to go through each and every single model and make that change over and over and over. And that is no good. That would take way too long. So having them into this prefab lets us sort of control it from one place. But yeah, I mean, the game's sort of starting to take shape. We have sort of our layout of the facility. We have some different prefabs and rooms, a terminal, door, and that's solid. It's all good stuff. So I figured at this point, it's time to just sort of keep on modeling. So I spent a little time experimenting with plants because I would like this facility to be sort of overgrown a bit. And so I came up with 4 just quick models here. These aren't really anything special. Really, they're more of just a test model just so I can experiment. I was thinking hard about how I was going to paint these models or add these plant models into the scene. And I sort of stumbled upon Polybrush. Polybrush seems to be a really interesting tool. There's plenty of things you can do with it. But the big thing that stood out to me was being able to paint prefabs onto a mesh's surface. And I thought that would be absolutely perfect for what I'm trying to do with the plants. And I ran into some issues with this. It sort of worked. I was able to paint the plants on, but for some reason, Polybrush will only paint prefabs on the outside of a model. So for example, with the corridor, it's enclosed, right? So when I painted on this wall over here, it would paint on the outside of the corridor over here. And that's sort of a problem. I mean, really the way we can fix that is by selecting all the new meshes we just created and then just moving them to the right spot. And yeah, that takes a little bit longer than I would like, but I think it's going to be the easiest fix right now. The other potential fix is creating a bunch of invisible planes that sort of sit on the walls of the corridors. And that's definitely an option too, but that kind of takes a while to build, especially if we might be changing the layout of the facility. So I think just moving them for now is what we're going to do. But I don't know, after all those problems, I sort of just set the plants aside for a minute and started working on some other things. I made an airlock with 2 different doors, and this airlock will be used for 2 types of doors in the facility. So first off, if you look back at our layout image here, you can see these little areas that says SZ, and that stands for sanitation zone. So essentially this would be a room in which the player would walk into, they get cleaned off, and then they can proceed onwards. And so these would be sort of a countermeasure for any contaminants in the lab area, right? That's what those are for. I even set up some particles for that. You can see here, it shoots out some steam, and I made it so the right light turns red. And yeah, it's looking pretty solid. It works very well. I took a while working on the script for that. It's definitely a bit of a more complicated script that I've done so far in this project, but it was a great experience actually getting to do some more real coding and work on something like that. It's actually kind of fun. Right now, I only have the sanitation prefab created. What I do plan on doing though is creating another prefab specifically for the outdoor airlock. This is basically going to be so the player can exit the facility because we want to have this sequence where you're essentially walking along the ocean floor trying to get to this, maybe like a little power station or some, repair parts, something, right? We haven't decided on that yet, but we do know we want the player to go outside and walk along the seafloor in pitch black darkness. I think that's just sort of a little fun experience for the player to really get a grasp on how isolated they are and how deep they are in the ocean. And so I will have to do that. That'll be probably for the next devlog though. Another issue, let's say, that I kept sort of running into was interacting with an object. So after making this airlock, I realized, just for context, the way I was sort of doing interactivity, for example, with the door, right? I was checking whether the player can interact with it based off of the distance to the player. And this is okay initially, right? It's fine for the door. But some things need a little bit more precision, especially if there's multiple interactable objects next to each other. So the method I went with this, I implemented a interactability script, and I did something today that I usually never do, and that is using an abstract class. Hello, this is future me. So I'm gonna explain this to Ace Man. He's here, yeah, in order to explain it to you. So first off, we have a script in the camera, right? And that's called looking at. And yes, that sends out a ray from the camera, and that checks what object the player is looking at.
Yeah. So
the reason then why I use an abstract script is that it lets me refer to any other script as the abstract script. So basically we can have an object with its own unique script, like the terminal, a script, for example, right? Which it's called its own thing, it does its own thing. But from the camera, we're able to run that script by only looking for an object with the interactable script. So it just makes it easier. You just have to just set it as an interactable child, and then you're all good to go.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's the reason. Bye-bye.
Oh my God.
I don't think I've used an abstract class ever before, other than for programming assignments for school. Because the thing with abstract classes is that they're not really necessary when you're working on a bunch of tiny projects. And I think that's the one difference between my school projects and game development. It's the fact that game development, you're creating a real program. It's a big project, right? School programs, sort of downfall with that is that they're very small. It's the instructions are sort of, okay, you're going to run this algorithm and print this output. That's all you're doing. You don't have to worry about organizing your project or worrying about, referring to a lot of different objects. But this is the one time that I found it to actually be useful, which I'm just sort of surprised because I've never used an abstract class in the real world. So pretty cool. But it works really well. So now what I did, I went back and I made it so that the player has to be looking at the object to interact with it. And that's actually really useful because I can now go through and say, okay, well, I want this interactable overlay, which I was talking about last devlog. And yeah, it works great. And honestly, I wasn't having too many issues, which working on games, usually I constantly run into issues. But don't worry, I had some issues later. So I got this really solid environment going. I wanted to make some terrain, right? Because of that whole outside walk I was talking about, right? And luckily Unity, being Unity, has a bunch of epic tools and they have a terrain builder tool. And so it was really easy to get set up. I just installed it and started building the terrain. Texturing wasn't super important since it's pitch black outside, right? But I did want to add a texture just in case. So I opened up this funky little program called Filter Forge. And I like this program because you can really easily create seamless textures. So I made 3 different variations of the sand texture, and that looks pretty good. It can be a little tiley at some points, but that's sort of the reason why I made 3 different versions of it, so I can overlay those on top and blend it in a little bit better. And I also made the stone texture. But yeah, what I did then, I just sort of painted all those textures in and it was looking pretty solid. You're not really going to see much of this environment at all in the game. But I just wanted it to be there just in case we ever do want to utilize that. But I was starting to get a little bit of a problem, and that problem is lag. And lag's no fun, right? We don't want our games to be slow. I realized a big part of that issue was that Unity renders in batches. And what a batch is essentially is your CPU sending some data to the graphics card. And so if you send too many batches, your CPU is getting bottlenecked and you can't fully utilize the graphics card. And so we want to minimize the number of batches. In order to do this, what we can do is we can mark the corridors and rooms as static. And when an object is static, Unity can combine it into one mesh and render it all in one batch. It sends all of the data for that mesh in one go. And so I went from sort of 9,000 batches on average, and in most of the places in the game it was under 1,000. And this immediately helped with the performance a lot. And so that was good. I'm glad I made that change now. One other sort of performance bottleneck I found was all the point lights. And I'm not going to address that in this devlog, but for now I'm just disabling shadows. I would like to have shadows, but it does not run well, right? So I'm gonna have to go back to that topic at some point in the future. And if I don't, please remind me. So yeah, sort of nearing the end of this devlog. The last thing I started working on was making the terminal interactable, right? We got all these interactability systems set up, so let's finish the terminal function, right? So initially it was going fine, right? Set up the script, click E to open the terminal, set some variables, all good stuff. This is where my problem started. So the way in which I set up this project, since I used the Unity template, the camera system in that template, it uses Cinemachine. It's pretty good, but it came with a few complications. So basically I wanted to lock the player camera into the terminal when you interact with it, right? Just makes sense. So it sort of zooms in and you can't move around because I want the player to be able to press some other keys when they're inside. So I could set the positions of the camera, but the problem I was running into was it would keep resetting the position. So for example, I click E, I go into it, and then I click right click to leave, right? And then as soon as I touch my mouse, it reverts to the original rotation of the camera. And that's not good because there's this weird snapping, jerking motion, right? And that's not what I want. So I spent a long time trying to fix this problem. This was the biggest problem I ran into during this past 20 hours of working on this, right? I eventually did fix my problems, though. I really had to take a close look at how the objects were rotating. So a little context, there's a few main objects that have to do with the camera. So there's the camera itself, and that's called the main camera. And, you know, that's the camera. Nothing to it, right? There's the player follow camera object. And this is where it gets a little more complicated. So we'll go back to that. But first, there's the player capsule. That's the actual player. And a child of that player capsule is the player camera root. And so the order in which things go, the main camera follows the player follow camera object, and the player follow camera object follows the player camera root object. Yeah, it's this big long list of following this and following that. So it's hard to know exactly which objects to rotate and which to control. So I realized I needed to rotate the player capsule on the y-axis towards pointing to the monitor. And then I needed to change the camera root on the x-axis to point at the monitor. So I'm having to rotate two different objects differently. So this took a while for me to really understand. I also realized what I needed to do was set the target pitch in the Cinemachine camera. It took me a long time to figure this out. So I'm not going to bore you with the details, but that's sort of what I realized. I also had to set the look vector in the player. And so the look vector is essentially the speed that the player is looking at the X value and the Y value, right? So up, down, side. So I needed to set that to 0 because if I didn't, when you would go into the camera and you would come out of it, the player camera would still be moving around. And that was a problem also. But after finally getting all of that working, we were gaming. Terminal was working properly. You could interact with it and the screen would turn on once you go into it. And that's great. We're on our way. Next, I have to sort of implement a system to add different texts to the terminals, right? And I was thinking of doing this just through the form of a very basic script. So you could fill out the script with the text that you want to be viewable on the terminal, and then it breaks it up into different pages. I'm also going to have to figure out how to use the Unity UI system a little more. I want to be able to scroll down on the terminal and view all the text. So that's all stuff I have to figure out. That's for the next devlog. Yeah, ran into some issues, but you know, I was able to fix all of them, and that's what's important, right? Yeah, that's going to be it for this devlog. I hope you sort of enjoyed listening to the process of how this went. As always, if you have any questions about anything or any suggestions for me, you know, things that I'm definitely messing up and need to fix immediately, please tell me, because I'd like to fix those things immediately. But thank you all for watching. If you want to see the next devlog, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for that. Hopefully that'll be out pretty soon. That's going to be it. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.